The most successful scientists can tell a great story.
Science is messy and complicated and hard and human.
Trying to bring some empathy into these scientific discussions.
There are all sorts of psychological effects of narrative.
There's a story going on there. In fact, there's usually a whole set of stories.
I think storytelling is hugely underrated but massively important part of science.
How are we going to tell a story with this data?
Hang on, this wasn't the scientific fairy tale I was told.
Hello and welcome back to the Storyology podcast, where I, material scientist and storyteller Dr. Anna Pajajski, take a deep dive into the intersection between science and storytelling. Informed by a host of brilliant experts, in this podcast I'm tracking the presence of story down the pipeline of how science gets done, from funding to publishing to public dissemination in the media. In the previous few episodes, we've heard how storytelling can be an incredibly effective tool for researchers seeking to secure scientific funding, but also that the system's competitive nature forces researchers to be strategic, selling their story as an individual over collaborative, long-term co-produced research. Last time we looked at how we might fix this system by encouraging creative exploratory stories that don't necessarily have a fully resolved ending, opening our minds to protagonist teams and not individuals, shifting the narrative towards one that is accepting of failure, and including other potential characters like the public in consultations to decide what gets funded in the first place. These next few episodes, we're going to be moving down the pipeline of science communication to look at the impact of storytelling on scientific publishing. So this is a stage where the scientist has successfully won their funding, they've done their research, and now it's time to submit their findings to the scientific record. The conventional way of doing that is by writing papers for academic journals. There are loads of different journals for all the different disciplines, and some are more prestigious than others. You might have heard of some of the more famous ones like Science, Nature, and the British Medical Journal. Although technically anyone can start an academic journal, they tend to be run as big, for-profit publishing businesses or housed in scientific societies like the Royal Society in the UK. The fact that they're for-profit means that scientists don't get paid to write for them, unlike pretty much any other commercial publication system that you can think of. Speaking of money, publishing papers is a scientist's own currency for promotion and career success, and it's every bit as competitive as the grant writing process that we've already heard about. Scientists are encouraged to publish both high quality and high quantity papers. The process of writing a scientific paper involves distilling the experiments and studies that a scientist or their team have done and writing that story as a nice linear narrative. Introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion is a typical structure. Now, once the scientist has submitted their paper to the journal, it's then passed through an editor and several unpaid independent experts called peer reviewers, who all have a say on the quality of the science and the story that is told. Once the paper is edited and accepted by the journal, the science then enters the scientific record. Papers are published online as PDFs and as print editions too. And some journals allow anyone to download the PDF. These are called open access journals. And some journals allow the scientists to pay for their paper to be open access, whereas otherwise it wouldn't be. For example, if you want your paper to be open access and it's published by Nature, you pay Nature £8,890, $12,290, or €10,290 per paper. Otherwise, scientific papers sit behind a paywall which is only accessible to subscribers. University libraries pay these subscriptions and allow their staff and students to access the research papers. UK universities collectively pay about £100 million a year for access to academic journals. In these next few episodes, we're going to be looking at the publication process from the points of view of researchers and journals, and the problems with the publishing landscape as it stands. You may have already spotted some potential issues. We're also going to discuss the role of storytelling in science publishing, why it matters, and some proposed solutions to make scientific publishing better for all of us. Along the way, we'll hear evidence from 6 experts who know all about the process of getting science published. Some of them are researchers that you've already met.
Dr. Alex Baker.
Dr. Jess Wade.
Clara Barker.
Louise Kenny.
But we're also going to meet some new experts who work in and around the world of science publishing.
I'm Nicky Dean. and I am the editorial director for the Earth, Environment and Social Sciences Nature journals.
Okay, so my name is Pen-Yuan Hsing, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bristol in the UK, working on research on research.
First, let's hear from Pen about why science is published.
I will sum it up by paraphrasing this amazing thing I heard from an author called Cory Doctorow, who said that if you look at what alchemists used to do hundreds of years ago, superficially, they have their research questions in mind. They were designing and running experiments, and they took a lot of notes. They were learning something along the way. But these alchemists kept everything they're learning a secret from each other. So every one of them had to learn in the hardest possible way that drinking mercury is a bad idea. And this was really inspiring for me. And I think the difference between an alchemist and a scientist is that when we do science, we are always building on what came before and learning from other people's experience and adding our own little bit on top of that. And what this teaches me is that without considering anything else, we have an inherent and fundamental responsibility to the scientific process itself to continue to share what we are learning with everyone else who comes after us.
This aspect of sharing research is really what we're talking about here. Pen's interest is in open research, which is the practice of sharing that research as broadly as possible. And we'll come back to this idea in a future episode. For now, let's hear from Jess about the scientific publishing process from a researcher's perspective.
I think it's probably different if you have like a science paper that's, a pure research outcome, or lots of the times, and certainly during the pandemic, a lot of us wrote lots of review papers, which were kind of analysis papers, but I'm going to leave that one because it's kind of less what I think the natural science process is. But usually, you come up with your experiment. It may be the focus of your PhD project. It could be a small part of that. It could be what you did your postdoc on. It could be one aspect of one of these proposals that you've written. So you've got your experiment. Usually you discuss different aspects of it in kind of weekly group meetings. So you've already done a bunch of the legwork that you need for the paper, because you've got the figures, you've presented it to peers, you've discussed what it might mean, you've got a bunch of insight into it. So in my group, certainly, but also in like most science groups, you'll have these kind of regular meetings where people will come together, both the person who's collected that specific data, but also other people, and you'll discuss it. So then kind of the next part is creating the story. It's kind of putting those graphs or those figures or those diagrams or those concepts in some kind of order to tell the story that you want to tell, to get the message across that you want to get across. So usually we kind of, we make the graphs, we optimize them, and then we put them in an order where we feel comfortable writing a story around it. And then, well, I guess you've done it in all of your meetings where you've presented the data before. I think you've kind of worked out where the critical parts are. I mean, you obviously start with much more than will end up in the final product. So you start with loads of auxiliary parts, which may go, or they may move to a supporting section of the paper. So you pretty much have everything there, but you put it in the order that will tell the most compelling story. So it's like from the beginning, this is what we set out to do. Here's our nice schematic saying what we wanted to do and what we think the impact might be of it. Here's the kind of build-up experiment just to show you what you kind of are comfortable with. Here's the kind of cool, whoa, they've managed to do that thing. And then here's our proposed little model for what's going on. So you have this kind of, framework in your head about what the narrative of the paper is, and you try and show that visually. And then I think around that, you'd start writing the text, and usually writing, captions for your figures, and then building the text and the discussion from there. I think you've got real space to have quite fun with the background. I think that's often like the introduction, the abstract, the background is sometimes quite intimidating, especially when you're early in your career, because, we've all done it, probably everyone listening, and maybe lots of people who aren't scientists have done it too. When you click on a paper and you look at the kind of introduction to the paper, you have those kind of the really sexy parts of whatever that research is. These molecules are going to be used for quantum computers. Quantum computers will transform every single aspect of our lives, from drug discovery to, sustainable transport to whatever. So coming up with a unique way to say that is often quite difficult. And it's really like your pitch, right? You've got this paragraph at the beginning, which is your pitch about why this is exciting. Then you've got a kind of overview of what's happened before in the field. And then you've got your little succinct summary of what's going to come next. And that, I think, is actually quite fun to write once you've like broken that terror of a blank page. And then, so you kind of, I'd say you build the body of the paper with the figures and the text around it and the discussion, and then go back to doing this kind of background and introduction. And then when everything's kind of wrapped up and you've done your conclusion and everything, then go back to trying to do your abstract. And actually you have a really fun task also of usually you have to make a graphic for the table of contents. So that's kind of a schematic, which comes from the olden days when all papers were published, actually published and printed. And then you'd have a little picture in the contents part that would drive traffic to your your actual article. Everyone would then go to there. Drive traffic sounds like we're online. I mean, it would make people flip to your papers, pages in the journal. But so I think I do it like that. And obviously that sounds like it's a really strict art, and it's really not. And papers can come together in lots and lots of different ways.
So scientists have to stand back and look at their findings and then choose a narrative that will tell the most compelling story. That definitely chimes with my experience of writing papers back when I was a scientist. But there are plenty of problems with this system. The first is the importance that we place on these stories, on these papers, a so-called publish or perish culture. Pen explained this as a key issue and took me through some of the unintended consequences of this culture.
The current focus on peer-reviewed publications as the core output of research and how research quality should be measured. And this, really creates a lot of perverse incentives. And I think it fundamentally corrupts how people do research. Because, at least in academia, you are incentivized by what kind of papers you can get out of your research and whether you can get that paper into a really famous and high-profile journal. Because whether you're applying for a job or applying for promotion in your university, or later when you're applying for grants, everything is based on the kind of papers that you published and the metrics around those papers. And it is, I think it fundamentally corrupts how people do research. One interesting point about that is, and I'm going to use a more contemporary example of how ossified the institutions are around publishing research, which is how, right now, if you look at the publishing landscape, right? A very recent problem is how there are a lot of junk papers that people would get published, written probably using some sort of large language model. And it's actually not even just generating the text of those papers, but including, their figures and illustrations. There's an infamous one published earlier this year, I think around, the first quarter of 2024, where if you look at the text, it's obviously, generated by large language models. But if you look at the figures, there's one that I love where it's got a lab rat, right, in the figure. And then it's got a huge, it's got huge testicles coming out of it. And it is so big that it actually extends beyond the figure itself. And I love this example because in the conversations that came out of it, first of all, people ask, okay, it's not just that the author submitted, a junk paper like this, but it got through the peer review and the editors and the copy editors to get it published in a journal. What does that say about the perverse incentives in the system? Okay. But the specific thing I want to talk about is that a lot of people are also saying, okay, so if people are submitting all of these, computer-generated papers, then maybe, the thing is to come up with an automated way to detect papers that are generated by large language models. And to be honest with you, it would not surprise me one bit if one of the huge publishers, in the near future, they will come up with one of these tools to say, hey, if you, hand your journal with us as the publisher, we will let you use this tool to detect these junk submissions. Superficially, oh, that might look like a possible solution. But in my view, that actually cedes more of our power and agency as researchers to these huge publishers so that they control our research even more. And then it doesn't solve the fundamental problem about why people are under so much pressure to have to publish, and it might make that problem even worse.
The competition makes scientists plan their papers strategically, as Alex told me.
Again, there is a massive tension there. So on my wall, I literally have a list of the next 9 papers that we're going to publish in the next year or so, if everything goes to plan. Because at my stage in my career, where just going independent, it is about, can you get papers out there? Can you get your name out there? And almost the importance of the science, sadly, is a close second to, well, you need to get these papers out so that then you can cite those papers on big grant applications you're going to go for. And then when you get the grant applications, that could lead to a permanent job. And then you can start to do science, how science probably should be done. Until then, you need to publish as many papers as possible in as high impact journals as possible. And you're sitting there and going, hang on, this wasn't the scientific fairy tale I was told 5 years ago at undergraduate, when I was told that, people publish science when it's in a good position to do it, and all the questions have been answered. And of course, if your work is publishable at an undergraduate level, that's the top end of the mark scheme. And then you kind of look at some of the stuff that you are putting together to publish and kind of going, well, it's still good science and it still adds something. But if you gave me another year, 2 years of funding, it would be in a much stronger position. And instead, you just end up kind of packaging your science and kind of going, well, okay, we're going to show that in this paper, and then this in the next paper, then this in the next paper. Because that way we get 3 papers out of it that will be in reasonable impact journals. And hopefully from those 3 papers, we can get more funding to keep working. Whereas actually, what would probably be better is just if you had a bit more funding to put all of that together, then you could seriously interrogate those questions. Because it is publish or perish, unfortunately. And it is a very, very broken system that, does to an extent also rely on how much do you publish, who do you know, all these kind of things, which I think people looking externally think, well, it's an entirely objective. Things get published because of, how good is the science? When to an extent, it's also, do you know the editor of that journal? Do they know your work? Which I think is the sad reality of human interaction when it comes to science. But having a famous PI massively helps, because they just kind of go, oh yeah, Professor such and such, it was good to see you the other day. Here's our latest paper. I remember sitting at a conference once, and there was a very senior academic having kind of a Q&A panel for young researchers. And they were asked, do you believe in double blind reviewing? And they said, no, I don't believe in double blind reviewing. I'd like to know who's written the paper. And their answer, they then said, oh, that's because if it comes from certain people, I know it's of a good quality. And it's kind of like, hang on, but you don't know that paper's of a good quality. Their past papers are of good quality, which is massively biased because you also know them as well. So it's humans trying to interact with a system that's meant to be logical. But I think if we didn't have that, the entire system would fall apart, because it would just be a nightmare of, you then get bad reviewers who can write some pretty horrible things because they also know they're entirely blinded. So yeah, it's finding a pragmatic line, really.
And Clara told me that she is strategic even at the sentence level of writing papers.
Papers are very much a kind of metric for how good an academic you are. There, are you going to get that next grant? A big thing is, how many papers have you done? How many citations have you had? And if you want to get cited, then your paper has got to convey some information. It's got to do it in a very smart, clean way. And you've got to make it consumable enough that people can take bits of that. So the more, information that you can put in there, the more nuggets of stuff that can be and quoted in other papers, well, that will make it a much more successful paper.
So with all these incentives and strategies going on in the world of scientific research, I put to Nicky, who works on the journals side, whether that makes scientists inherently unreliable narrators of the stories that they're telling.
Probably, yes. It's one of these interesting things. You know, we all have these roles and personas, right? And so we've been talking here about authors versus readers versus researchers. As you just said, they are also all the same person. And we do this every day right here at the office. It's like, you know, authors and reviewers, and they're the same. And the reviewers think about themselves, oh, I'm a reviewer now. And then the moment they're an author, they're frustrated about these reviews, right? Like, and it's one of those like wonderful contradictions that we have as humans, right? It's an interesting point that you raised, this idea about the unreliable narrator, and probably there's probably a lot of value in and more need for that kind of reflection when you're reading, because you tend to just read things, you know, I'm in reading mode now. How do I feel about it? When you're in the writing mode, you often don't. And this is something, again, that we talk about when we do these training sessions. A lot of the advice comes back to imagine you're the reader, right? Put yourself back in that situation. If you're reading this, and it's obviously very difficult to do, if you're reading this as a impartial person without the knowledge you have, how are you approaching it? Think about it like that. I think if you consider a lot of these checks and balances that we covered about peer review and what evidence you're putting in, you're trying to, in a lot of ways, you're trying to mitigate that idea, right? That you're unreliable, potentially unreliable. So the hope is, if you have the right evidence presented and you have the right controls in place, and you're presenting in your extensive supplementary information document all the other tests you did to eliminate the confounding variables or whatever it might be, and you're clear about the assumptions, that you still have that reliability. But I wonder to what extent people do consider it from that unreliable narrator perspective. You know, unreliable narrators that's an intentional storytelling mechanism, and authors of papers, generally speaking, don't think of themselves like that. Now, of course, there are always examples where that's not true, and we can point to all sorts of famous ones. But I think that then the reviewer is perhaps trying to come at it from the perspective of, do I think this person is an unreliable narrator? Now, they're maybe not using that language, but perhaps that is part of actually the dynamic that's playing out. And maybe we would benefit from thinking about it in those terms a bit more, which are terms that we typically understand, right, in the day-to-day experience, and that maybe that's that kind of thinking could mitigate some of these aspects.
But overwhelmingly, the biggest common observation when I asked researchers about the problems in the scientific publishing industry was the F word. Here's Louise.
One of my set lectures is about the importance of failure. We don't celebrate failure enough in science, but I have been involved in several epic failures, which, had they happened at an earlier stage of my career, might have ended my career at quite an early stage. Fortunately, I was a little bit more mature and a bit more robust when these things didn't work. But I talk regularly about the importance of celebrating that failure, because it's not really failure. Okay, so we didn't prove my hypothesis, it didn't work. But that negative result is really good, because A, it's going to stop someone else from doing it. B, we've closed down an avenue of research that was becoming quite hot and topical. And, we could have spent a lot of time and wasted a lot of money, or even in the kind of research that I do, we could have introduced, potential treatments that didn't work. So, I give this set lecture about the importance of celebrating failure, and actually not calling it failure, but just calling it, a negative result. This was a hypothesis that didn't pan out. Yay! Let's publish it and stop anyone else from repeating the same mistake. But it's that's really difficult to do when you can't go into a funder and say, I don't know, it may not work. Who knows? It's 50-50, but give me the money anyway and I'll tell you. There's an element of where we sort of almost have to overpromise. And that's fine, as long as that doesn't then poison the well of your actual research. And as I say, unfortunately, there are a few examples through history where that's probably happened.
This only works, though, if the journals are willing to publish those failures. And, as Louise mentioned, the stakes are higher for researchers just starting out in the race. Here's Clara.
Yeah, I think that we definitely shy away from the null results, the negative results. So the work that I did, my PhD and then my first 3.5, 4 years as a postdoc, so that was sort of 8 years worth of work, maybe. And a lot of that was null results. It was trying to figure out how stuff worked. And that's very, very difficult to publish. You can't really publish it. So it's interesting. And I've thought about this before, but, a lot of that isn't publishable necessarily. There aren't necessarily papers as things are now. But it made for a very good thesis because there was a lot of experiments and there was a lot of stuff. And, in there, I think if you're doing a thesis, okay, maybe you've written some code. Maybe there's a big set of code, or maybe I designed a new electrical system. Now, yes, that doesn't go in your thesis, but it can go in the appendices because it's still a part of look how much work I did and look how much went into this. And I think that that's where it's nice, where you're like, this is all the work I did, whereas you won't necessarily do that in a paper. And you will. I know that, I was, with my thesis during my Viva, I was told how many experiments did you do? You did so much. And I was like, yeah, I kept on doing it. And yet I published very few papers because most of it was well, this don't seem to work. And this don't seem to work. And so this is why, papers aren't necessarily a good metric of academics. They are to a certain degree, but they're not the full story. And this is why the first 2 years of my PhD, I went to a conference and I'd been talking to people throughout those few years who had been working in the same area as me. And I think I went and I'd been talking about stuff that I was struggling with. And everyone's like, oh, right, okay, yeah. And then about 2 years later, I was like, okay, this doesn't work and this doesn't work and this doesn't work. And they were like, yeah, we knew that. But it is that competitive nature and this idea, and people aren't talking about it. And yeah, so science is still competitive. Science is competitive. And funnily enough, if we succeed when it comes to inclusion and equity, then all we're going to be doing is making it more competitive because all of a sudden there's more people that aren't being pushed out for arbitrary reasons. So, and so, of course, people don't want to share the negative stuff, but if you were able to write a paper on the negative results or the null results, then maybe and that counted as, equally as a positive paper, then I think that could really change the landscape. I don't know whether it'll happen, but it would save people time and they would still feel that was really valuable work. But I think that, if you have a successful academic and think that they've never had any failures, if they never think they've had any failures, then I don't believe them, And so you'd think that everyone's the same. But also journals have this, I think, and, thinking about it in a story way, I think that they prefer positive stories to negative stories. And so they want to show success and they want to highlight success. They don't want to be associated with failure. And so I think that the journals have got a big part to play with that as well.
Of course, there are always different ways to tell any science story, as researcher Jess explains.
I think you do have that space, though. You have that space to be like, we were thinking it could be X, and then we found it was Y. I don't think it's quite as, I tried sample A, didn't show anything. Sample B didn't show anything. Sample C didn't show anything. Like, I think you have a way to tell that story, right? And I do think there's space, and actually it makes for a much compelling read. If you're comparing two different theories, and one of them turns out to be true, then of course you include both of them. I think too many papers just become a kind of observational report of something that's done. And, every time I review those, I kind of write, this is like a master's thesis. Like, it's just like, we did this in week 1, we did this in week 2, we did this in week 3. No one could be bothered to accurately, properly analyze it or make a story about it. So I do think there's space for that. I don't think there's space for, we tried 15 antibodies from this supplier and they all didn't work. I still don't think there's space for that. But I think there'll be different platforms for that. It could be Octopus. It could be different kinds of platforms where we share this behind the scenes knowledge of science. So there'll always be this place for a kind of technical science magazine, which is what Nature and Science and, whatever the journal is. I think that we've got to, the model at the moment just seems to be upsetting everyone. And the funding councils keep saying that, the name of the journal isn't important, but I'm pretty sure everyone who's doing the reviewing for them thinks the name of the journal is important. So we just need really clear guidelines about what people, it comes back to that point before about how we define what's great. So I think there is a space for wrong hypotheses or getting things wrong, making a prediction that proves to be incorrect. You've just got to choose the way that you tell it.
So storytelling is where we will leave our investigation this week, and it's a thread we'll pick up on next time as we ask what role storytelling plays in scientific publishing. What are the risks and what are the opportunities when we bring story into science? This podcast is made in partnership with the UK Reproducibility Network, Sonic Screen Lab at University of the Arts London, and StoryArcs at Bath Spa University. StoryArcs is an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded programme. All of the opinions shared in this podcast are those of the individuals and don't necessarily represent those of their employers. I've been your host, Anna Podajski, and if you want to read more about me and my work around science and story, you can head over to the Storyology website at storyology.co.uk. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.